So if you followed me through the last lesson, we actually created this Dieline from scratch just for our artwork, which in this case is the top portion of our box. Perhaps you found something online, perhaps you can ask a printer to send one to you. But in either case, once you receive or you've created a Dieline that you're ready to apply your artwork to, this is how we go about imposing it. So you'll need a few things ready to make this easier for yourself. Bring along your renders from Adobe Dimension, because this is a really good reference point to remind you the outcome you're looking for. And then in Illustrator, you'll want not the exports, but the original versions of your labels and any background elements you've used. So when you're ready with those items, the first thing we want to set is our background. And we're going to lock all of the guide layers. So we've got dimensions, fold, cutting guide, and flaps. And we want to work just on this bottom layer here. So the first thing I'm going to do is drag a shape that is essentially going to be our base, our background color. And because our box needs to have some artwork printed in regular ink against the black, we're not going to use a black box and then just print gold foil on. We're going to have the base of it behind the foiling printed from the Dieline. So you could actually open Dimension and you could find the exact color that you used for the base. I know that the one I'm happy with is 33, 33, 33 RGB, which gives me a matte black. I'm going to copy, paste in place, and then finally rotate this so that it's perfectly overlapping the bleed, and you can see there's no area where it's kind of missing. If I did that and then the printer trimmed and even a little bit of a white was stuck on there, then that would look horrible on the packaging. So you want to make sure it goes all the way out to your bleed guideline, and there we have the base. Now because this is the top of a box, we're essentially going to fold this down, and this face in the center here would be the very top of a box. I'm actually going to use this flap here at the bottom to be the front. So I'm going to look at my preview again to remind myself. And I think the first thing I'll try to position is our pattern. So let's get our pattern in place, and I'll grab this from the background elements. Now you'd have a few options here. If you'd use something like this image, you would, of course, using a version that you'd licensed, you'd simply paste in and you'd manually position this to cover that face. Now, if you were happy to crop this and to simply have it end at your bleed marks on that face, then that's quite easily done. If, however, you wanted a portion of it to just bend around onto the next face, that's a little more tricky. So the method I'd recommend for that would be to duplicate this. I've just pasted on top, so we've now got essentially two copies of it. Use that as a guideline to crop this left portion, and then do the same in reverse to crop the right hand portion. And that way you actually have the two separate elements of this image, and you can rotate that into place on your next face. The problem is, because we have to allow for a bleed, that's not going to be completely precise. The printer can't guarantee that the two portions, when they're trimmed, are going to line up perfectly. So depending on the item of packaging and where certain folds and joins are going to go, you may actually want to avoid having artwork that's detailed, that flows across faces. With a pattern, you can usually get away with it. You certainly never want to do it with text, and even with an image like this, I'd recommend caution. So that's just a little technique if you came across that with your artwork. Otherwise, keep it maybe to one face for simplicity. In my version though, I need to take a background pattern, and I have an expanded version of it here. And I'm going to need to position this really to flow across the background of everything. So I'm going to do that now. And this may deviate a little. I'm not going to slice it into 5 different pieces. It may deviate a little from what we see in the concept here, but because it's so abstract, I'm happy that the concept is still going to work. So I want to make sure I've got the bottom layer selected, and we could do a new layer, and here we could paste this pattern, and that's come out absolutely huge. So I'm going to zoom out, scale this down. I want it to at least cover most of our artwork there. That's good. And you could either leave it like this, but I think this looks a bit messy with so much of this overlapping. So what you could do is, once you're happy with the positioning, select it, cut it, select your base color, and you'll want to make sure your base is just one object. Mine was 2 objects, so I'm going to use the Pathfinder and unite. And then over in the left here, on the drawing modes, we're going to switch to draw inside. And finally, I'm going to paste that in place inside my base color. When I deselect, we have much tidier, unnecessary, but much tidier looking artwork on our die line. Now, don't forget the locked layers. Ultimately, they are not going to be printed. They're just there as references. So, this is actually what we have so far. We've got the base here for our box. And again, this is where it's good to flick back and forth to your 3D model, because you'll notice I needed quite a subtle finish for that background pattern. But at the moment, this is really bright and really loud, and it's showing in full color. So I'm going to double click to select my pattern, and I want to lower the opacity. In my 3D mockup, I was down to almost 20%. I'll see how that looks here. That to me looks maybe a little too faded. So I'm going to go up to 30%, and I'm happy with that. I'll turn my guide layers back on. So that's dealt immediately with something that can be quite tricky, and it can be very off-putting. If you've come up with a 3D mockup like this, and you're excited, you're ready to send this to print, and you suddenly realize, well, we're not printing with folds that link around the side. Instead, we're printing with separate flaps that need to fold together, which means perhaps you can't print across all of these faces. Well, suddenly you realize why an understanding of die lines and how this works can save you. So in my case here, because my pattern is so abstract, this is absolutely fine. I'm happy for this to fold together. That's going to work well. For a real life project, having experience with this and perhaps the difficulty it could cause if you had a more detailed background image, well, that experience helps you guide your clients. And it's why sometimes you may avoid certain ideas because you know it will cause you a headache when it comes to printing and production. So you'll be pleased to know that was the hardest part. Now we just need to position our labels in place. Now there are 2 possibilities. One is that we're not using gold foiling, and I'll show you the method if that were the case first. So with this layer selected, I'm going to go across, I'm going to select and grab the artwork for my front label here. I'm going to paste, and again that's come out absolutely huge. So let's scale that down proportionately. And again, with a real life project, you would be far more careful and precise. So I can see from the little magenta guides that pop up here, that's perfectly centered. So I'll release that. Now you could outline your type here, but I would highly recommend first getting the sign off from your client on the die line before you outline your type. Because if you needed to make any changes, if perhaps they changed their mind on the fragrance, where you'd have to start dragging all your labels into position again. So I would keep it live text until the absolute last moment. So that there reflects the effect I'm looking to create on the front of this top face of a box. Next, let's go to this face to the right, our story. So if you think about how this will fold from the die line, we'll need to use this face on the right here, but we need to orient the artwork so that the top of the artwork is facing the top, this center portion of the die line. So again, I'll go to my labels, going to select and copy, and I'm expecting this to paste huge again, which is the case. So I'll just scale this down to roughly the size I want, and then we'll zoom back in. And this is the one I've got to orient 90 degrees to the side so that the top of the artwork is facing the top of the box. And actually, because this hasn't exported from the artboard, where I'd kind of cropped the details of this flower off, we've got a choice here. We could leave a little bit more negative space around the edge, or I could enlarge it and just have the flower bleed off the side. So it depends. You have the option to choose what you think is best. I think the key is that there's equal space visually around the key line and the edge. So looking at the red cutting guide, I think that's where I want to place it. Visually for me, that looks nice and comfortable and balanced. And what I'd suggest is grouping your artwork for this label. So I'll do that with Command G. And with that grouped, I'm going to just unlock this layer here where I know I've got this stroke for the dimension, and I'm going to shift click. So I've now got the artwork selected and this stroke. I'm going to click so that you can see that's highlighted in magenta. That's a selected object. And now if I use the align tool, I can align that vertically so that it lines up, and I know that's perfectly centered within that space. So that's a little tip you could use. It's always worth making sure things are precisely aligned rather than eyeballing it. So this is how our artwork's looking. We've got two of those faces ready, and now we're going to repeat that technique to place the ingredients on the back. So let's go across to our labels. I'll grab this artboard for the ingredients. Again, I'm expecting this to be huge, so I'll just scale this down. And something I need to do for consistency, I'll just group that artwork, is first of all position it and make sure it's exactly the same size as this box we have on the right hand face here. Otherwise that's going to look very amateurish. So they're the same size. I can now drag this roughly in place. I'm going to rotate it so that the top of the artwork is nearest the top of the box, so that when they fold down, that's correct. And I'll use the same trick again to center this. So select the artwork, select that stroke, left click to highlight that stroke, and use center. And that was already centered nicely. Vertically, I don't have anything I can grab here. So what I'm going to do is create just a little rectangle for this purpose that spans the height of that face. I'll shift to select both that and the artwork. I'll click to make that rectangle the key object, and then I can click and align, and that did just shift slightly. So it's a bit of a headache aligning things, but it's well worth getting that right rather than sending something to print and realizing it's not quite centered. So I'm going to lock the dimensions again. Now, just to finish, some of you may have picked up on this, but there is a small mistake to our die line. Now, although the printer could happily work with this artwork, we actually have the flaps outlined in a separate color, and our cutting marks, if it were sent to print like this, would actually chop off our flaps, which is not what we want. So technically, some of these lines here, where they're just inside of a flap, they should actually be folding lines. So that will be the final adjustment we make to this artwork. And I'm glad I made this mistake, because it's a good chance to show you how to work with this once you've put it all together. So to make this adjustment, first of all, I would hide the artwork we've just imposed. So that's on the bottom two layers. And now we can just see our die line, which is still, of course, positioned perfectly. We want to unlock our guide layer and our flaps layer. And using not the regular selection tool, but the direct selection tool, which will enable us to choose just one path at a time. We're going to click and then shift click and select every one of the paths that has a flap sitting outside of it. And we're going to hit the I key to bring up the eyedropper, and we just want to click on this dotted line path, which will then copy the style to the lines we had selected. So we now have the correct folding lines showing on this artwork. So it's up to you. You could, I think for the printer's purposes, leave the flaps outlined like this in their own color. There'd be nothing wrong with that. Or you could give the entire exterior the same red cutting line and just remove the little blue line we still have on the interior of the flaps. So I would do that by clicking to hide the guide layer, and again using the direct selection tool, so you can bring that up here, or by clicking the A key, and we just want to click and delete and click and delete the inside paths of each flap, which will open this up nicely. If you want to check that matches up, you can twirl the guide layer back on just to see you've not missed anything. And the last step will be to select all of the artwork on the flaps layer, and you can use the little area here. Clicking that will select all the artwork on the layer, and we can change the color again by hitting I for the eyedropper and selecting our red path from our guide layer. Deselect, and we've now, as it should be, got a red cutting line which can be used for the entire exterior of the die line. And our folding lines are now showing in the correct place. Now for some printers this really won't matter, they're going to work with the artwork you'd sent them anyway, but in case, let's say you were working with a particularly thick type of card, and maybe the printer using their die cutter was going to perforate some of the folding lines or score them in some way to make it easier to fold, well then having this laid out and having a distinction between folding lines and the cutting line would be essential. So I'm glad we've come back to adjust and include this at the end. If we twirl on the visibility of our artwork, we can now see everything in place. So hopefully the time we've spent looking at how to create a die line and just now even make a small adjustment to it for a certain printing scenario, hopefully this prepares you and it gives you an understanding of how your artwork would be sent to print. Now I appreciate for the class project it's probably just the 3D mockup that you're looking forward to sharing and showing off in your portfolio. But I'm going to include this Illustrator file for the die line just so you can open it up, reverse engineer it, deconstruct it if you like, and hopefully learn something from playing with it yourself. Now a last step we'll include before this would be theoretically ready to go is indicating which portions of this artwork should be gold foiled. Now if gold foiling was included, usually your printer wants to see something certainly on a separate layer, and usually inked in a way that their machine will be able to pick it out from the rest of the artwork. So sometimes they'll ask you to place it in 100% magenta or 100% black. Now you can see my document color mode is already set to CMYK. So although there's some transparency and blending going on, this would all be output as a CMYK file. So to indicate our artwork to be foiled, first of all, we're now going to outline the type and also expand any strokes. So to do that, I'll click this first group of artwork on this face here, and the shortcut to outline type is Control or Command Shift and O. And you'll see the type, it's now lost its live effect and it's outlined. And next we'll go to Object, Expand Appearance, and we'll ensure we expand the fill and the stroke. And doing that gives us a single foreground color for all of the artwork we have selected. So we're simply going to double click in the color palette, and we're going to change this under the CMYK values to 100% magenta and click OK. Finally, we'll cut. I'll create a new layer and call this gold foiling and paste in front, which positions that artwork exactly where it should be. Now visually this looks awful. We've got something that's bright magenta in the middle of our artwork, but this is to indicate to the printer this is the portion to be foiled, and we simply repeat those steps. And then just don't forget to cut and position that artwork on your new gold foiling layer. And as a final check, if you twirl off the visibility, you can check what's going to print on the gold foiling plate and what will be printed with regular ink. So that covers quite a wide range of scenarios you could run into when wanting to prepare your artwork for print. But at least now, as well as being able to design something that looks stunning, you have an awareness of a process that takes place for actually getting this artwork to print as you intend it.